the power of story, why stories are so important in our lives, why we crave them so much. And once you understand the power and purpose, the purpose of a story, then you can write to that purpose. And I think the stories that really resonate with audiences are stories that are right on purpose, as opposed to something like, if you're thinking, well, I just want to entertain, I just want to have a lot of set pieces and show great things you've never seen before. Well, okay, that might be entertaining, but you might be missing something that's really important. In other words, that story that you're going to be writing or filming will be off purpose. You know, it's not the purpose of a story. And so audiences will walk away with kind of like, yeah, that was great, but you know, they won't really know, they won't be able to put, you know, their hand on it about why they didn't really enjoy it or why it didn't really resonate. And that has to do with the purpose of a story. What is the purpose of a story? What is it meant to do? And so I talk about how stories, I mean, every culture from the beginning of time has had stories. Some cultures may not have created fire. Some cultures may not have invented the wheel, but there's not a single culture in the history of mankind that has never had stories. So stories are truly universal. Every single culture has had stories. And why is that? Why they're the shape they are? Why we've been telling stories up to today, and still we probably will be able to tell stories till the end of time. And that's because they are crucial to our survival as a species. Without stories, we would not have survived. We would not have evolved to where we are today. So I like to say that stories kind of teach us. They teach us how to survive, how to live, how to be human, how to interact with each other, how to change and deal with problems in the world. And stories that don't do that fail. So that's my spiel about stories. Because they're part of us. In other words, we evolved with stories, and so stories are part of us. Our brains have evolved to, what I've heard people say, we're hardwired for stories. In other words, our brain is evolved to appreciate stories in a certain way, to do what it's supposed to do. So I like to use the example of a sugar-coated pill. You know, like kind of things that you give to a dog, and the dog needs the medicine, but the only way the dog is going to eat the pill is if it's surrounded by sugar, right? Like to make it really appealing. Stories are that. They're sugar-coated pills. So at the core of a story is the meaning, the purpose of what it's supposed to do, which is to teach us a specific lesson, right? And everything else is the coding to make it entertaining. In other words, all the comedy, the horror, the suspense, all those emotions that we talk about, that we love, that we pay money to see, are the sugar to make it entertaining. So in order to tell a good one, so you have to know how to make it entertaining. That's part of it. But you also can't miss that kernel, which is the meaning. Why that story? What are you trying to say with that story? What's the message you're trying to say? So you have to know that because stories are lessons for us, and the only way we could relate and the only way we could absorb that message is to see someone experiencing what we're supposed to learn. So there's this thing called mirror neurons, which I don't know if you've heard. Basically, our brains kind of don't know the difference between imagination and reality. So this is something that was discovered by Italian scientists. They were studying monkeys and they were trying to figure out what happens in their brain when they do things. So they were studying a monkey grabbing up a banana, and they saw what part of their brains lit up. Okay, and then they saw the brain of a monkey watching another monkey grab a banana, and they saw that it was the same exact firing patterns. In other words, the same part of their brain of the monkey seeing the monkey grab a banana was the same as if the monkey was grabbing the banana. So this is called mirror neurons. This is something we have too. And the lesson of that is that when we watch something, when we watch a character in the screen going through something, our brain is thinking that we're doing it. Okay? So if you see a couple kissing, the same parts of the brain will light up as you kissing someone. You may not actually feel it, but it's the same parts of the brain. So you're experiencing what's going on in the screen. And if a character is struggling to accomplish something, you're, by default, you're watching this, and in a subconscious level, you are learning what the character is learning. So for me, great stories are about teaching us how to live. And the way to do that is by showing a character who changes, who transforms. And that transformation, because change is so difficult for us in real life, we need to see a character accomplishing that change to see how they did it. And that's how we learn. So that's kind of a quick way of saying how to tell a good story, which is like show a character who struggles to achieve a certain goal and who transforms as a result of that and has a great resolution. And all that surrounded by, dramatic techniques that keep us engaged, because that's very important. That's another thing that I was talking about story, is that stories were designed to feel good because it's the way for us to pay attention to. In other words, you need to make the brain pay attention to your story in order to get the lesson out of it. And all the stuff about, entertainment, that's the paying attention to. In other words, when you show, for example, you create suspense in a thriller, right? Your brain is doing something that makes you pay attention. That's how we evolved to do that. So, dopamine, there's oxytocin, which is the empathy drug that mothers get that when they're with their babies. We get that when we hug someone. So oxytocin is what's called the social or the bonding hormone, because we're social animals. And so when you see a character and you create a character that you care about, so there's actual techniques, dramatic techniques you can use to make us care for a character, then oxytocin is going through your brain and you bond with that character. You care about that character. That's what keeps you engaged in the story and you're paying attention. You're not disengaged. So that's how you tell a good story. And if you don't know this, if you don't know how to make us care about the character, which I see that all the time, right? You read scripts that don't work, you see movies that don't work, because we don't care about the character. So that already you failed. If you don't care about the character, I don't care how many bombs or set pieces or thrilling twists you have. We just don't care about the character. You're just not going to get the story. You're disengaged. You're bored. So caring about the character is step number one. Step number two is keeping us engaged through, again, dramatic techniques. And hopefully you have a purpose to your story, a meaning to your story. So there's when you finish, the story is finished and you think about it, you go, oh, I get it. And that's how you appreciate it. That makes a story good, I think. For character, and I talk about this in my Pixar seminar, so because they masters of this, they tell stories about toys, about monsters, about bugs, about robots, right? Fish, rat. They make you care and connect with those characters. So there's a whole bunch of techniques, and you can see what they do, and you can know what the techniques are. For me, it's like there's three things that you do is make us feel sorry for that character. So there's little moments where you can create a moment in the story where a character is unjustly abused or unjustly mistreated or insulted or betrayed or neglected. And so it could be any character. And if that moment is there, you're going to feel sorry for that character at that moment. It takes an instant. So that's one. If you show that they're like us, if you show their humanity, for example, you show that they care about something other than themselves, that's another technique. So there's a moment in the movie Leon the Professional, which is about a hitman, right? And it opens with him doing a hit and he kills people. You don't know if he's good or bad, but he goes home and he takes care of a plant, right? And that right away you say, oh wow, he cares about a plant. So he's okay, he's human. The other part is admiration. So this is like any kind of, if you're dating somebody or you're trying to find somebody who's a good match for you, there's that list of things that you like in a person. That's admirable traits. So somebody who's funny, who's responsible, who's courageous, there's a whole list of things you can add to a character to make us say, oh, well, I admire this. Usually they're like the best at what they do. They're like the best the best ad executive or the best agent or the best cop or the best driver. They're courageous. There's a whole bunch of them. I mean, I have a whole, the list is all in the book. There's all these lists of things you can do. But if you do these three things, and so when I show clips of the moment you meet the character, and it's usually like a 3-minute scene, you can see all these things being applied in like 3 minutes. There's like, the opening of Wall-E after he's done with the garbage and he comes to his little house. It's a 3-minute scene, and there's about 20 of these techniques done. This is how you connect with that character in one scene emotionally. I also show a clip of an ad, a commercial. It's a 1-minute thing about a lamp. Where it's a great ad for IKEA, award-winning commercial, where they make you care emotionally for the lamp, right? And the joke about it is that the guy comes on and says, you probably had feeling for these lamps. That's because you're crazy. The lamp it's only a lamp. It's, and the new one is better. The new lamp to replace it. So, but anyway, it's great. It's amazing once you know those techniques, and then you see them in action. You go, oh my God, And I kind of always feel, I always give this caveat to my students and to anybody who hears me speak, that if you love stories, if you love films, and you don't want me to destroy the illusion, do not listen to me, because I feel like I'm one of the magicians who give you the trick of how it's done, and then you see the trick and it's not the same anymore. So I always feel bad about that, because once you know the techniques and you see a film, you're going to see them everywhere all the time, and it's going to kind of ruin it for you. So just fair warning right there that this is how we do it, and that creates that effect. The lesson is make sure you make your character human. Make sure it's realistic. Nobody's perfect, right? So when you have a character who's completely perfect, that we don't really buy it. But these techniques are used for characters who are also, quote, like villains. For example, I always use The Sopranos, Dexter, Breaking Bad, as a character who's technically not likable, or they do something that's kind of immoral, and yet we connect with them, we care about them. So that's how it's done. So you can use this on any character. The trick about, the thing about how you do it specifically is really up to the writer. I like to see these techniques as tools. You have these tools, and then it's your job to apply them well. You can apply them and put all of them in one scene, it's going to look ridiculous. So it's almost like a painter, and you have your brushes and your colors and your little touches here and touches there, and then the effect is artistic, but it's up to the artist. You could do it badly, you could do it good, you could do it balanced. That's up to you. And another one that I like to use is As Good as It Gets.
Sure.
Melvin Udall. I use that in my UCL classes all the time, because that's a character that was purposely created to create the worst character ever made.
Right.
The most disliked character in New York who falls in love with the most liked, sweetest waitress. That was kind of a romantic comedy in that vein. And I thought when you see the first 10, 15 pages of As Good as It Gets is a masterclass in that, because he's doing things that are like horrific.
Right.
They always say do not harm an animal, and he's there throwing the dog down the chute. He insults people, he's misogynistic, right. He's racist, whatever. But as soon as he walks into that door, into his apartment, and you get to see that he's compulsive disorder, that something is wrong with him, right there, that's the first hit of feeling kind of sorry for him, Somebody could be totally bad, but when you find out they're sick, it's part of us to feel kind of sorry and kind of connect. And then there's the whole thing with the dog. Despite the fact that he threw the dog down the chute, the dog likes him. Yeah. So that's another thing. And then he takes care of it, so that's another thing. So gradually we get to really like him and connect despite his flaws. Traits for me is the last thing you should worry about. I know it's like this is the same about character development and how to create characters, and talk about, make sure you give them positive traits, negative traits. But that's just one aspect of it, and that's the easiest thing to do. For me, it's more about what happens to your character and those things I talked about, like the pity, humanity, and admiration, and kind of balance the three. And then everything else you can show in that scene or in future scenes. Well, the emotional core is part of a bigger picture. The reason I use Pixar is because, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Pixar and their stories. I've never been disappointed with any of their stories. I think they're masters at telling a story, and specifically about characters and how to and connecting with characters, especially since most of them are not human. But the emotional core is really what I call the heart of the story. And so the heart is obviously the character you care about, but that's one half of the equation. The other part of the equation is their what I call the worthy motivation. What is it that they're trying to accomplish in the story, and why should we care? In other words, usually there's an emotional stake from that goal. So for example, Finding Nemo, he has to search for his son, and something we connect with, we think it's a worthy motivation. So that's Finding Nemo, Story About Fish. In my Pixar seminar, compare two similar stories, in this case both stories about fish and the ocean. One was Finding Nemo, Pixar's, and I compared with Shark Tale, which is DreamWorks' story. And when I show the opening of Shark Tale and the introduction of Oscar, played by Will Smith, you can see the audience reaction when you compare the two clips, who they care about. The reason we don't really care about Oscar in Shark Tale is because his whole motivation is about getting rich quick, and about getting, it's something we relate to as human beings, but I've never seen a film story about somebody who's trying to get rich and that's really successful, that's appealing, in other words, that we root for. Even though it's something that we do, we're all ambitious and trying to get rich and trying to better our lives, but you never see stories about that. Why is that? So, because we don't really consider, we realize it's not really kind of a worthy thing. It's not what life is about, right? Life's more about love and connecting and helping your friends. And if you look at the motivations for the characters in Pixar, and I have a slide with all the list of all the movies that they did and all the worthy motivation, and 90% are about saving the village, saving a friend, rescuing a friend, saving their mother, searching for their son. I mean, it's all relational. It's all relationships. And really the lesson you get from all stories, at least from what I'm aware of, is that it's all about relationships, about connecting with people. So it's all about love. So that's the thing about Pixar. So you make us connect with a character, and then we have to see them for 2 hours doing something, and we really have to root for them to do that. So when it's a worthy motivation, then we root for them, and we're connected with them, and we're engaged because of it. Day one, you would start with obviously the idea. What's your concept? So I think concept is important. Once you know your concept, and there's ways to make that concept appealing. The class I'm teaching tomorrow morning will be on concept, how to make sure your concept is high. And by high concept, I know there's a term for high concept in Hollywood, but for me it means that there's high appeal, meaning that as soon as you hear the idea, you go, ooh, there's something about it that just like hooks you, and you go, wow, I want to find out what it's about or how it's resolved. So that's what you should have first. The next thing that you should think about, for me, and I know there's controversy about that, whether you do that first or later. For me, I need to know what it's about. In other words, this whole story will be a reflection of what you're trying to say. Like, what's your theme? What's the meaning of your story? And if you don't know what it is, well, you could try developing a story and write many drafts, and then you figure out what it is. You go, okay, that's possible. A lot of writers do that, and that's okay. But I always use Paddy Chayefsky's quote, where he says, lucky is the writer who knows his theme from the beginning. Because once you know that, I always suggest you write it in big letters and put it in front of your computer so you see it at all times, because most of your characters, most of your scenes, your whole story will be a reflection of what you're trying to say, of your theme. And so it's better to know it right away. It'll save you a lot of time from trying to write many drafts and then come back to it and cut what doesn't work and create new things. But if you know theme, so for me it's concept, then theme, and then once you know your theme, then you can create your characters, because your character will be a reflection, especially if your character has an arc, will be a reflection of that theme. And so you know where your character is going to start, and now you know where your character is going to end, and then you can figure out your scenes and your story. In terms of all the stuff I'm talking about, character connection and motivation, all that stuff, those are details that you can add later. But what I'm talking about is the foundation of stories, which is, what is your story about, and how does your character transform to reflect that theme that you're trying to convey. And yeah, that's the foundation. There's two types of themes. There's what I call institutional themes, where you're trying to show society. You're trying to show something that's wrong with society or with a particular institution. The TV series The Wire was genius at it, because every season was a specific institution that showed the flaws of that institution. And so Network was about, the flaws of society and the TV business and
media
how crazy,
culture, yeah.
Right, exactly. But I don't think there was a character there that changed or transformed. In the same way that you have, something like Star Wars or Finding Nemo, which are very strong with character arcs, and what the character learns at the end is, the epiphany of what exactly you want to tell the audience, and so that reflects the theme. King's Speech is another one. I mean, there's a lot of really well-received films that, if they're right on point thematically, even Star Wars is thematically rich, but we don't think about it because we're thinking about the space opera part of it and the technology and the good versus evil. But there is a character arc in there, and it's actually a thematic argument through the story about what it's about. It's usually an argument between two things. And in Star Wars, it's technology versus the energy, the force. And if you look at the scenes and you really pay attention to what they're talking about, even Darth Vader makes that argument in the scenes with his superiors, with whoever Peter Cushing plays. It's not the Emperor. No, it's not the Emperor, but whoever, his boss. And all these scenes you have where he talks about the dark side of the Force, and on the other side he's talking about the power of the Death Star, of technology, and that's the argument. And then Luke and Obi-Wan have the argument about the Force and owning the Force. And if you look at the last moment, that moment where Luke has to decide versus the Force and technology, right, the targeting system, and at the last second he makes that choice, that's his epiphany. That's the decision he made. He could have kept, he could have chosen the other thing, could have chosen technology with the Force. That would have been a different story, right? We're saying, well, technology is more important than the Force. In this case, Lucas wanted to show that the Force is more important than technology, and that's what Luke's decision, that's what he showed, and that was what the audiences walked away from, It really depends on the writer. There are writers who are okay with solitude. They're able to be by themselves for many, many hours, days, years, and I like to call it the temperament of the artist. They're people who are meant to be artists because they have the right temperament for it. Even though they're social animals, maybe they're okay with not being social. And so they're able to do this. Other writers are not so able to do this, but you can still be writers and be in a social environment. For example, I know writers who gravitate toward television, not because now television is the golden age of television, but because it's a more social activity. In being a TV writer, you're in a writer's room. You're with other writers. You create with other writers. When I was speaking to Akiva Goldsman for the 101 Habits book, he talked about how he loves the balance of being a writer and a producer. He loves being a producer because being a writer is by himself and alone, and then being a producer, he gets to be on set and being social and be with other people. So it's a good balance. So you could have 100% all social and still be a writer. There's writing teams. Billy Wilder wrote with partners throughout his career. So there's that social aspect of it, being in a room with somebody else. And then there's writers who are okay with being by themselves and write, but alone, and then kind of being social afterwards, with their friends or on the set. For me, I'm one of those writers who are very comfortable with their solitude. I come from an artistic family, and they're okay with, I guess it's genetic. Uh-huh. I'm okay with being alone. So there's a difference between being alone and lonely. Sure, absolutely. There's a difference. So, and so that's me. It's part of the artist makeup. I think certain people are meant to be artists, not because they're creative, but because their emotional being is able to accept that. There's no doubt that being an artist, you have to be alone. in solitude, to create, unless you have a partner and you're doing it together. But most true artists are solitary, you know. And you're right. In a Western society, it's frowned upon. You know, they will see somebody who's alone as somebody who's like, you know, potential serial killer or something. You know, it's just not. It's frowned upon. It's how much you can take. It really depends on how much do you care about what other people say. How much do you care about that? You know, I mean, I see people, for example, you're right, somebody who dines alone in a restaurant, surrounded by social animals and they're by themselves, will know that they're getting the stares and the stigma and the judgment, right? But if they don't care, they're going to be okay with it. It's only people who care about. Now, I'll be honest with you, I care. You know what I mean? Like, I would not eat at a restaurant alone, even though it probably would feel, you know, it'd be great to taste the food and enjoy the experience. But because of the fact that I know I will be judged and negatively, I try to avoid that. I also had that problem with going to the movies alone. But now it's less. Now I don't care about movies. But restaurants, I still care about that. Yeah. So if I want to taste the food, I would just get the food to go and eat, you know, in my place with the actual food. So I'll get to taste the food. But yeah, because see, so that's the difference between how much you care about, how much you're aware of what people are thinking about you. That's it. Because you're right, it is a negative stigma. First thing that I always want to teach about scenes is that scenes are mini stories. They're a tiny little story. And just like a story, you got to think about a beginning, middle, and end for a story. You got to be thinking about the point of that story. So what is the point of that scene? And usually, because you want to make it engaging, you want to have some kind of conflict in the scene. So that's why you usually scenes about one person don't really work that much, because, okay, you wonder what's the conflict, unless you're talking about a character who wants to go up the mountain and struggles to get there. Okay, there's conflict there. But most scenes are about two people. And they're usually, just like in a story, about somebody wanting something and having difficulty getting it, right? There's your conflict right there. Goal and obstacle. Aaron Sorkin likes to say intention and obstacle, right? He doesn't start a scene unless he knows the intention of the character and the obstacle to that intention. Once he knows those two things, he can start a scene. So that's the basic tip of it. And because there are many stories, I always found that when I analyze a scene, a well-written scene, that it is structured like a story. There's 3 acts to it. There's a beginning, middle, and end, and therefore there's 2 turning points in the scene, rising tension, a climax, a resolution. And it's fascinating to see in a 2-3 minute scene how, you know, and only for the well-written scenes. There are scenes that you watch and you go, oh, okay, you know. But there are some in movies where you have great scenes, and those scenes are usually full stories in that scene. So that's my advice for that. Craft. I mean, if you're a beginning writer, you got to learn the craft. And not only you got to learn it, you got to practice it. So you will not, I mean, unless you're a genius who does this instinctively, which is a possibility, you will not accomplish this in your first script. I mean, if you read the 101 Habits, most screenwriters who sold their script usually was their 10th or 14th script. They usually have been working on it for many, many years. So it takes practice, you know, just like any other craft takes practice. And so learn the craft and practice the craft. The other thing too you should know is that there's a lot of information out there about storytelling, about screenwriting, a lot of how-to books. And you got to understand, you know, I always recommend read them all. You know, I mean, I'm a lifelong learner. I read everything. I always try to learn, you know, always, always, always. And when you see the same thing being told, then you got it. That's what I call the basics. Once you learn the basics, then you got to go beyond that, right? And that's what I try to do in my Writing for Emotional Impact book. I go beyond the basics. You know, the book is structured with all the main elements of screenwriting, you know, of storytelling, concept, theme, character, story, scenes, description, dialogue. And the first part is the basics, all the stuff that you should know by now. And now I'm going to teach you the craft, which is what really you should worry about, which is what is the effect of your writing on a reader, on an audience, and your audience will be a reader. A reader will be your first line of defense. Somebody's going to read your script, and if they're not engaged by your writing, they're not turning the pages, then you failed. You're done. So you got to learn how to do it. You got to learn how to hold somebody's attention, and you got to learn how it's done. In terms of actual symptoms,
right.
I mean, there's writers who do not understand conflict. They don't know what conflict is. They write scenes that are basically two people talking and just revealing exposition. So it's kind of like they just want the audience to know certain things about their character or their past or about the story. But this is the writer's intention in the scene, not the character's intention. So you get these scenes that are just basically talking heads, just exposition. That's the most boring thing there is. We're not grabbed, no matter how interesting the information is. So conflict, lack of goal, we don't know what the character wants, or we don't care about the character, or the scenes are just, what they're talking about, what the story is about is kind of cliche. We've seen that story 100 times. The concept is, what I call soft concepts. There's nothing in the concept to make me want to see the story. When you think about how you choose to watch a movie, usually you see the poster or you see a tagline or you see a trailer. You can tell. You like analyze how you feel about it when you see it. And you go. Usually for me it's the concept. When I know what a concept is about, when I read about a script that's sold and they say, story is about this and this and this. So you have the log line. Right there, I know whether the movie is going to be successful or not, just from that, because either the logline has a hook to it, and you go, "Oh my God, that's interesting," or, and that feeling, that is what. That's why producers or agents don't request your scripts, because they're just, the concept is just too flat or cliche. But if something is really, there's a hook to it, they're going to at least request the script, and they're going to read it. Now the script might be flawed and it's going to get a pass anyway, but at least it's going to be requested. So if you really have a great concept, which is what I recommend, go for that. Make sure your concept has a hook. There's a lot of controversy about that.
Oh, please, we like that.
Yeah, I love controversy, is it?
Well, a little bit, yeah.
About structure, because this is something that everybody teaches and everybody likes to have their own version of it. So you got Michael Higgs, you got McKee, you got Truby, Hero's Journey, Save the Cat. The key. So here's the thing about structure. So I believe in structure. I think everything in life is structured. The way we appreciate story is structured. In other words, we've evolved to understand, appreciate stories because of the way they're shaped. Okay, so like Eva Goldsman, for example, talks about how in the fashion industry, every shirt looks like a shirt, even though it may be a different cut, different material, whatever, but a shirt looks like a shirt. That is the structure of a shirt. The structure of a human being is the skeleton. All skeletons look the same, no matter what is on top of it, right? Even though as human beings we're all different, but the skeleton, if you rip off all of our stuff, will look the same, right? That means all human beings have the same structure. If a human being didn't have a skeleton, they'll be like a ragdoll piece on the floor, right? They would not exist. The same with stories. Unstructured stories are not as appreciated as structured stories. At least that's my experience. No matter how you label it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you label the inciting event, doesn't matter what you label the beginning, the middle, or end. It's still structured. And so all stories are structured. All stories have the same structure, not necessarily, that whole thing that they teach you, which I think is ridiculous. The page numbers say, okay, this has to happen on page 12, and if it's not, you're doomed. No, that's silly. Or that you have to have an inciting, all stories have an inciting event. That's that. But the whole thing about, midpoints or all is lost, darkest moment, dark now, all this stuff, there's exceptions to that. But most stories have the shape of stories, which is, rising tension, climax, resolution. That's kind of inarguable, I think. So I'm a big believer in structure. Now, in terms of the actual labels, that's up to you to decide. I mean, the way I learned structure was to basically read everything and to really kind of like learn what other people have said from the beginning, and kind of, if it didn't resonate with me, then I didn't absorb it. But there's always something where something does resonate with you and you suddenly understand it, and so you adapt that to your own work, to your own lesson, to your own craft. So, my labels for structure might have little pieces from all the different ones from that has been taught so far. And that's what works for me. It doesn't necessarily mean that it would work for someone else, So it's up to you, up to the writer to really study all forms and really understand why that is. That's the most important thing. And when you think about stories, when I talk about the power of stories, I kind of show why stories are shaped the way they are. It's kind of the way we're conditioned to accept them. And if they're not there, we're just going to say, that was weird. That doesn't fit, doesn't seem like a story or something. And so something will be missing. And I think that happens a lot from writers who don't know structure or try to say, well, structure doesn't exist, or whatever negative connotation they have for structure, which is, it's going to make me uncreative and it's going to be like cookie cutter formula and all the stuff people say about structure. Well, I do show a slide of human beings that look different, and when you take away all the stuff and you show skeletons, those skeletons look the same. So you can't argue that human beings don't have the same structure. They do have the same structure, but they all look different. It's the same with stories. Stories all have the same structure, but they all look different. I mean, one of the things about storytelling is that we respond to new. We're conditioned to respond to new things, to pay attention to new things. That's what we like. High concept, part of it is like what I call the uniquely familiar. You have to come up with something unique we've never seen before that's also familiar. There's this joke about the executive saying, just give me the same thing, only different, right? Probably heard this before. That's what it means. We want to see stories that are different but familiar. It's so the same thing but in a different way, different angle. So the thing with characters is that, as we see more and more characters in more and more stories, we have to come up with something that's new. We have to come up with new characters or new traits or new goals, and that's getting harder and harder and harder. So because of that, I think they're becoming more complex. I think because of all the entertainment that's been done, good storytellers are aware of that. And by the way, to answer your previous question about beginner writers, one of the things the reason we see a lot of material we've seen before, kind of like cliche stuff, is because they're not aware of what's been done before. So part of your education as a writer is really to know what's been done before. So you really got to be very knowledgeable you have to be a geek about this, about knowing all the movies that have been done before and all the TV that's been done before and all the comic books that have been done before, so that when you create something, you try to avoid that and come up with something unique. Now, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything has been done before, but I'm always amazed, I'm always excited when there's a new concept or something like, oh my God, that's brilliant, because it's familiar but it's unique, So it's so there's always that. It's all about creativity and originality, and that's really a big part of being an artist. You have to be original. Yeah. That's what we respond to. Absolutely, we're probably the biggest procrastinators there is, and the only reason for that is because writing is hard, creating is hard. I'm probably the biggest procrastinator there is. Every writer will relate to the experience of trying to do anything else but write. The whole thing about sharpening your pencils and doing your laundry and cleaning your house and answering emails or playing solitaire. On one hand, it's something that's advised because there is that whole thing about the creative process where, we're talking the gestation period, where you're supposed to think about your problem, your creative problem, and then kind of ignore it and do something else that's unrelated, that helps creatively. So people think, okay, that means procrastination, you could do other things. And there is some truth to it. The problem is if you're constantly afraid to write, and so you're trying to do other things, then you'll never write because you're just constantly procrastinating. So there's got to be a point where you got to put that aside and actually write. So you got to get over it. And there's plenty, I mean, online there's tons of advice about procrastination and how to avoid it, because it's not just for writing, it's for everybody. Everybody procrastinates, you know. Anything that's worthwhile to do and it's scary to do, people will procrastinate because it's just scary.
You've said that fear is more what's at stake, not writer's block, that there really isn't writer's block.
There isn't any, right. At least I don't believe that. It could be I'm wrong, but I think it's fear. It's fear of success, fear of failure, fear of being judged negatively, fear of being embarrassing yourself. You know, those are certainly all fears that I relate to and that, you know, I have to overcome.
Well, why do you think we put the label of writer's block on it? Like I've heard some people say, well, you know, I'm currently blocked right now, and it's like it's an affliction.
Because
like
it sounds good.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's like, oh well, writer's block is an artist. I'm a real artist because I have writer's block, but block just really means you're not writing. It just means the words are not coming up, and the words are not coming up because fear is creating a tension that prevents you from writing. You know, that's what it is. So. You know, it's like saying, you know, a plumber doesn't have plumber's block, right? They just go to do their job. It's about doing your job, showing up at your job. You have to understand that writing is a job, whether you get paid or not. You got to show up to your desk, and you got to put your butt on the chair, and you got to type words. You know, so that's what it is. And so we use that as an excuse. We say, well, it really is fear of writing, fear of whatever, all those procrastinating things I've said. But it doesn't sound to say, oh, I'm afraid. It sounds a lot better to say I'm blocked, because then people can go, oh, poor you. Oh, yeah, you're an artist.
Right.
You know, so it sounds better. But it's just fear. You know, and again, there's plenty of material out there about how to overcome those fears. So it's all psychological stuff. You just have to overcome. And it's usually because, you know, the writing, they didn't respond to the writing as much as they wanted to. They really expected the pat on the back and being told how great it was, and chances are it wasn't as good. So really it's up to you. It depends on how thick your skin is. It's about how much you want this and how much you're conscious enough to understand that feedback is important and that you should take it as it is. You should look at it as constructive criticism. And pay attention to it and rewrite and make it better. It's all about making it better, and you really got to know how to do it. It's a big part of the Hollywood job, you know, as a screenwriter. I mean, you know, I've never heard of something being just first draft. You know, it's always draft. I mean, you know, 30 drafts, 40 drafts. You know, so they're constantly, and you got to be able to do that. If you're the type of writer who does not like to be told that something is wrong and wants to say, no, this is the way it is, it's my art, and that's the way it is, you shouldn't be writing screenplays. You should be writing novels or plays. That's really the only two professions where the writer is king, really, unless you're doing television. I guess television, the writer is king there. But mostly novelists and playwrights where, yeah, the editor can tell you something is not working and you can take it or leave it, but it's really you have the final say on it. Then you should do that. But, you know, I think people who have thin skins or are very sensitive about creative feedback should not be screenwriters. I mean, they're in for a really, you know, very frustrating experience if that's the case. If you're an aspiring writer and you finish your screenplay, always give it to as many people as you can to read and get feedback on. Very important. When it gets to the point where, you know, the only feedback you get is, wow, this is great. I would love to see this movie. Then you can start marketing it. And so there's different ways you can do. I mean, you can try to meet agents, producers, network, go to events, try to query, you know. I talk in the book about the 101 Habits, how query letters is you know, anybody who tells you to do query letters, don't listen to them, because that's not how it works. So it's really word of mouth. It's all about recommendations. So, you know, an agent will read your script if it's recommended by somebody they trust, so you have to give it to somebody they trust, So it's really about knowing people, and the more people you meet in Hollywood or LA, the better, because then you can network in that sense. For people who are afraid of that, who are not social and have a tough time making relationships, I always advise to enter a contest, because that's the easiest way. You just enter a contest, preferably a reputable one like the Nickel or Austin, Sundance. I mean, there's a lot of them, but there's only a few that are reputable. I don't think anybody cares if you won some really minor contest. And I got to say, when I was working in development, we used to read the winners of certain contests because we liked the concept, but the scripts were not good. They were flawed, even though they won the contest. So it's really about the competition of who you're competing against. So enter reputable contests, and if it's really good, if your script is really good, it will rise to the top. I always believe in cream rising to the top. So rise to the top, and then people will request a script. So it's a good way to have your script read by others if it's really good. So enter as many contests as you can, get feedback, and see what happens. That's the only. Or if you want to do it by yourself, if you want to raise the money by yourself and do Kickstarter campaigns and make your own movie, that's fine too. You can do it, but get feedback first, because there's a lot of writers who, like I said before, are too sensitive to feedback, and so they try to avoid feedback. They try to think that their stuff is really great, and they try to do everything possible to make that movie, and they raise money and whatever, and they finally do it. That's great. And then it fails because it wasn't that good, and audiences don't respond to it, and you just wasted all this time and money and energy. So feedback is paramount. The first thing you have to understand about dialogue is that it's got to be connected to the character's desire line in the scene. In other words, if a character has an objective, an intention in the scene, the dialogue has to match that intention. And what I see a lot of times, especially with exposition and information, is that a character is saying all that information, and you can tell that it's really the writer's objective. In other words, the writer wants the audience to know this information, because they think, okay, the audience needs to know this and this and this and this, so the character is going to say this and this and this and this. And that doesn't work, because scenes and dialogue are about a character's intention in the scene. Everything a character says is matched to what that desire line is. So anything that doesn't belong to that doesn't fit. And you can tell whether it's the writer wanting to know that information, wanting the audience to know that information, whether it's part of the character. I was trying to think of an example. So one of the best questions you can ask yourself for every single line of dialogue in your scene. So write the dialogue, first draft, just do what you want to do. Don't worry about that. But when you reread the dialogue, ask yourself for every line, why is that character saying this? Why is that character saying that specific line? Most of the time it will be because they're responding to so they're reacting to something, that's fine. But a lot of the times you will find that a character is saying something because you want the character to say that, not because the character wants something in that scene at that specific time. So you gotta know what the character wants, and then every line of dialogue is a strategy for that character to get what they want. And if that dialogue is not that, then you rewrite the line until it fits that. Now, exposition, there's ways to make sure the exposition in your dialogue matches the objective. For example, if I'm suspected of murder, and you're the detective who's asking me questions, right? And tell me, where were you? And I didn't commit the murder. Well, whatever I'm going to say is my desire to make you think I didn't do the murder. So there's a reason why I'm saying that line. I didn't do it. I was at the movies. Saying at the movies is exposition, but it's connected to my desire to convince you that I was not the killer. You see? So the exposition matches the objective of the character. So there's ways to do this. There's plenty, there's techniques to make sure the exposition is subtle, you know, part of conflict, part of your desire line, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff you could do, but that's the lesson you really have to know. That's the most important thing. Make sure you know what every character wants in the scene. Make sure that what they say matches that objective. So I always bring out David Mamet, who's, you know, genius at dialogue, and he said once, nobody says anything unless they want something. So unless you want something, nobody says anything, because nobody's going to say, you know, hey, I'm a trustworthy character, right? I mean, if somebody said that to you, you're going to be thinking, whoa, why is he telling me this, right? There's always a reason. Why? So there's always a reason. And if we know what the reason is in the movie, if you know what the character wants, or you're trying to figure out what the character wants, that's more interesting than somebody dumping exposition, you know. Characters who just dump exposition, it's just boring because it's not connected to a desire line. Even characters who disagree with each other, even though that might be kind of interesting because there's some tension there, if we don't know what they want, it's going to be boring. So you see this a lot with amateur scenes of people like, oh, I need conflict, so my character is just going to argue, and so you have the people arguing back and forth, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just, right, because we don't know what they want. And that's really what makes something interesting, is intention and obstacle to that. I like to talk a lot about contrast. So if you have two characters in the scene, it's really always more interesting if the characters are contrasted. So if a character is speaking in a formal way, so somebody who's an academic or a professor or a doctor and he speaks in a formal way, make sure that the person that he's interacting with speaks in a more slangy way, or, you know, more contracted way, because that's going to make, you're going to create that contrast. You know, just like in painting, if you want to highlight the color blue, you surround it with yellow, right? It's opposite. So it's the same thing with characters. A lot of the techniques in the dialogue chapter in the book are about individuality. How do you create individual voices? Because having all the characters sound the same is a very common problem with dialogue. It's usually the writer's voice, and Sorkin has actually been criticized for that all these characters sound the same. But when I talk about his dialogue and I show clips and actual scripts, I showed that he actually does individualize, and the characters sound different. So it's an unfair criticism, but you have to do that. You know, it helps if there's some, difference in character speech or cadence or contractions versus, stilted writing, grammatically correct writing. Why is connected to curiosity, and I think all great artists are highly curious individuals. For me, I'm just curious about everything. So the reason I love writing so much is because, just like learning about something. I mean, I'm not the first one to say this, but I write about things that fascinate me because I don't know about them. In other words, I write in order to learn. I write in order to learn more about a topic and answer that why question. Why is this done, or how, or whatever. So, but the why, in terms of writing, connects to the reason why characters do what they do. That's what audiences really want to know, and that comes to motivation. So motivation is really important. I mean, it's the cliche actor's question, right? Like, what's my motivation? Why am I doing this? Why am I saying this in a scene? Well, when you're writing a story and you're creating a character, and you have all these things happening in the story that you've come up with. So, okay, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, and this is going to happen. You got to know why. Audiences really want to know why, because if it doesn't connect to a universal motivation, it's going to feel contrived and fake, and that happens all the time. That happens with, you go and says, you know what, that character would not do that, and you might be true about that, So for me, why connects to motivation. It's like, once I know what a character wants, the next question is why. And you better have a good answer to why a character wants what they want. Why do they react a certain way, which creates the plot. It all comes to character. It's all psychology, How original the writing is, how much of a world is explored, right? Because somebody who's not really curious about something, it'll be flat, because you only get like just a certain level of material, right? Whether it's one-dimensional characters, right? Be just like one surface of a character, because you didn't go deeper as to the research or knowing about that character or their psychology. So that's, I feel that when you come across stories that are really rich and deep, you can tell the writer was very curious, because they dug deep, and that's what they explored.
So Silence of the Lambs?
Perfect example. Yeah. I mean, look at all the richness of detail of character psychology, even that world. The Godfather, perfect example. Yeah, I mean, just you can tell the artists that are really curious about the world they're writing in, and the characters. Those who really write truly three-dimensional characters and great complex relationships, and yeah. So that's how it affects it. And not everybody's curious, so that's why you have good writers and bad writers. Originality comes from being curious, because the more curious you are about something, the more you know about something, and so the more you can avoid copying something, right? I think the people who have cliche writing, because they don't know what's been done before, so they go, to them it's new, and they go, oh, they think it's good. But people who know, and they've seen it 100 times because they're curious, will say it's cliche because they've seen it 100 times. That is actually the bane of the writer's existence, especially the screenwriter, to come up with something new. I mean, when you think about, I think in the second edition of the 101 Habits, Bill Marsili, one of the screenwriters there, talks about doing the 20s. So for him, like everything that he thinks about, any event, any scene, character, whatever, he thinks of kind of listing 20 different ways of doing it. Like if it's like talk about the meet cute, right, in a romantic comedy, how people meet in a cute way. Well, he's going to do 20 different thoughts about it. Okay, they can be this, they can do this. I mean, he does 20, because the first 2 or 3 or 5 of them will be cliches. Will be things that you're automatically going to think about them because they're the most famous ones. They're the most that we've seen 100 times. But by going deeper, and he forces himself to go deeper, that's where you get the creativity and the originality. And eventually, when you reach that past the 10 or 12, 15, all the way up to 20, you'll start getting some really original ways, because you forced yourself. And so that's what the writer needs to do. You got to force yourself to go deeper in order to create some original writing. You could try it as a game. It's a tip that he uses as a like habit of creativity, to just do the 20 for anything. 20 different ways to rob a bank, 20 different ways to say I love you, 20 different ways to break up with someone, 20 different ways to kill someone. I mean, there's all these things that you've seen 100 times, and when you see it over and over, you go, you go, huh, because you've seen it 100 times. And it's only the movies that break out, the stories that break out are the ones that are kind of truly original, right? The thing you should be aware of is human dynamics. Psychology, emotions, character relationships, that you should be well versed in. Now, lucky is the writer who has had an amazing life experience and had all those experiences that he can write about. That makes it easier. But it's not necessary. If you're a highly curious person, I mean, you could be a great writer who's had a very mediocre life. I mean, I'm not a believer of the Hemingway thing about, if you want to write about adventure, you gotta go and be adventurous and stuff. I mean, maybe there's some truth to it, but I think it really depends on your mind and your curiosity, and I think we can all find, it's all about your imagination. If you're highly imaginative, you can write about anything, whether you experience it or not. I mean, if you write science fiction, George Lucas didn't experience going on a ship in order to be able to write about it, right? Or James Cameron, do you think all the stuff about Pandora and Avatar, that he experienced that in his own life? No, it's all imagination, right? So that's what you need. You need to know. You need to have high imagination, obviously. But then you need to be well versed in character relationships. So yes, if you've had experience with character relationships, that's great, and character conflicts. But if you haven't, you can always learn it. And if you're highly curious, I mean, I have a psychology degree, so if I wasn't a writer, I'd be a psychologist, because that's what fascinates me. I'm fascinated by human interactions, human psychology, and especially the reason why people do what they do, which is what characters do in stories. So really, that works for me. But my life story, as much as I consider it very unique and different from most people's life stories, I don't have a desire to write about it. So it doesn't affect me at all in that sense.